have a special video up over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program, and it's about how a letter that the IRS sent out to 3.9 million Americans saved 700 lives. And you're like, wait a minute, the IRS saved 700 lives? How did that happen? Well, it had to do with Obamacare, and it's a fascinating story. And it turns out that this analysis of this IRS mailing was actually the first time that the federal government has done a study that actually proved that people having access to health care produces fewer deaths. For every 1,648 people who got the letter, there was one fewer premature death. I'll explain the whole thing in the video. It's you know, as I said, it's available over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and it is really worth checking out. And it's a great ad, essentially, for a national health care system. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmering and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number: the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimmering and Hawkins' results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, "New research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest," end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, "Firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates," end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. "A slave is as good as gold," Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. Author.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, it's a beautiful Tuesday here in Portland. I hope your day is going well for you, and you have a chance to get out and breathe some fresh air and walk around. I should have brought the mask upstairs. I'll get it tomorrow and I'll show you, or maybe during one of the breaks. A friend of Sean's is making masks, and Louise and I went we've been going for our walks with these little, it's like America is getting fashion conscious about masks. You see pictures of people in Asia where the government just passes them out to everybody, and everybody's wearing the same white mask. Here you've got masks with cats on them and masks with, of all different kinds of colors and all kinds of cool stuff. So anyway, step by step, right? Donald Trump last night had a complete meltdown on TV. If it wasn't, and God bless Paula Reed over at ABC News, at CBS News for holding his feet to the fire. It was pretty remarkable what she did. I mean, she literally was interrupting him to point out the fact that he was lying. And she kept saying, all of February, what'd you do? Nothing. Well, he went golfing several times. He held several rallies. He was on Fox News a bunch of times telling people that there's nothing to worry about and everything's going to be good. So that's, basically what he did in February. Now, the Trump administration has published a timeline of things that the CDC did in February, or some functionary in the HHS did in February. Trump. Oh my God. And, I didn't watch the meltdown because I don't watch the Trump reality TV show anymore. I mean, this is really what it is. Trump is saying, I've got a big decision to make. When to open the country. Well, he never closed the country, right? It's up to the governors to do that. And individual mayors and county officials, they can order shutdowns. There's plenty of state quarantine laws that go back to yellow fever epidemics in the 1800s that empower them to do those things. Tuberculosis, polio. I mean, there's been a bunch of diseases that we've had to deal with and that we have actually enshrined in law. Not so much the disease, but the power of local officials to shut down their areas, their municipalities, or their states. And there was in 1976 a law passed called the National Emergencies Act, which does somewhat increase federal power. This was, following on the backs of I believe the case was Youngstown Steel. It was the name of the Supreme Court case back in the 1940s, late 40s, or maybe even the early 50s. Frankly, I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly when it was. Probably was 50-51 because it was the Korean War, and Harry Truman was president, and he went in, and Youngstown Steel was in the middle of a strike. Their workers were on strike. And so Harry Truman, the president of the United States, went in and seized the steel company and said to the workers, you guys are now working for me, and you will go back to work, which they did. But then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, sorry, Harry, you can't do that. You don't have that kind of authority. Now, as I said, I believe it was 79, that authority was somewhat updated. 76, actually. It was the National Emergencies Act of 1976. That power was updated, but still, it's not total. Trump does not have total power over anything. Well, he's got total power, I suppose, over the West Wing right now. And in fact, I mean, well, let me just recap, and then I want to get to Trump's tweet this morning and what's going on with this. And by the way, for our program today in our first hour, basically my question, and I'll ask it right now, and then I'll give you the setup for it, is this 40-year, and it's 40 years to the year right now. It started in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. 40 years later is right now, more or less. I mean, we're just 6 months short of it, I think. And maybe 7, 8 months, whatever it is. Is the 40-year Republican plan to destroy American government and give all power in this country to the oligarchs, to the billionaires, is that plan disintegrating right in front of our eyes? That's our question for the first hour. Our second hour, how much damage can Donald Trump do to blue state governors? He is up to something. And I'm going to lay all this out in our second hour. And it looks to me like he's basically, I mean, he's got the federal government seizing ventilators and masks and PPE, personal protective equipment, PPE, going to states and to hospitals, literally seizing them and taking them to pass along to red state governors. I mean, this is getting weird. So that's our second hour. In our third hour, Dr. Bandy Lee is going to be with us. She is the psychiatrist from Yale who wrote a fascinating book about Donald Trump and company. It was called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. So she'll be with us in our third hour. So back to my riff here about the 40-year Republican plan disintegrating. People are wondering why Donald Trump melted down at his press conference yesterday. And there's, in my opinion, really a simple explanation. The plan is falling apart. It's just that simple. It's literally falling apart. Back in 1980, when David Koch ran for president on the Libertarian ticket, this was kind of the beginning of the whole thing. Back in 1980, when David Koch ran on that ticket, and I'm going to read to you parts of his platform. This was David Koch's platform in 1980 when he ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian ticket. Got 1 million votes, by the way. We urge the repeal of all federal campaign finance laws. We favor the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid. We favor the repeal of the fraudulent, bankrupt, and increasingly oppressive Social Security system. We propose the abolition of the governmental postal service. We oppose all personal and corporate income tax. We support the eventual repeal of all taxation. All criminal and civil sanctions against tax evasion should be terminated immediately. We support repeal of minimum wage laws. We advocate the complete separation of education and state. Government ownership, operation, regulation, and subsidy of schools and colleges should be ended. We condemn compulsory education and call for the immediate repeal. We support the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency. We support abolition of the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation. We demand a return of America's rail system to private ownership. We advocate the abolition of the Federal Aviation Administration and the Food and Drug Administration. I mean, it just goes on and on, right? This is David Koch's agenda. And it has become the Republican agenda. It was put into place when, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, in the election of 1980, he was sworn in January of 81. And their strategy that when Reagan won, Reagan inherited that strategy. And the strategy was convince people that the American government, this government that, George Washington had 3 horses shot out from under him trying to form, that American government is actually evil and incompetent and useless. And because the Supreme Court in 1976 and 78, the Buckley and Bellotti cases said, no problem, billionaires can fund politicians, Reagan, in his 1981 inaugural address, they helped him get into office. He says, government was not the solution to our problems, government is the cause of the problems. And that 40-year plan was supposed to hit its peak with the election of Donald Trump. He was going to take down the final pieces, Obamacare and privatize Social Security and shut down the post office. He was supposed to do all that stuff. And now with the coronavirus, Americans are realizing, government can do things, and we want government to do things, like save our lives, please. More than anything else, except possibly his own narcissism. This narrative arc explains why the Donald Trump presidency is collapsing, why the Republican Party is collapsing, as we saw in Wisconsin and the returns yesterday. It's just a shame it took 40 years to make it happen.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So do you think the Republicans' 40-year plan, this 40 years of neoliberalism leading ultimately to oligarchy, is disintegrating? I think it is. And welcome back. Don in Santa Cruz, California. Hey, Don, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Great show. Well, following up on what you were just saying, in the 70s and 80s, I worked on Capitol Hill and in a certain agency of the government, and a memo crossed my desk in 1981. And it was written by, I believe, the chairman of 3M, and he had just returned from a captain of industry retreat in Aspen, Colorado, or something like that. And anyway, the memo started out by saying 3 issues facing our civilization. 1, are we going to blow ourselves up? 2, can we live harmoniously with this environment? And 3, can we control corporate power? And that framework is how I have viewed everything that's been going on ever since. But that's not really why I called. What I was wondering about was when I look at this delay to the corona virus spread, I often think about when Leo Szilard went to Einstein, and they went to FDR. Within the week, he started the Manhattan Project. There was no delay, and that makes me wonder what would have happened had this president been in the Oval Office during World War II. Would we even have survived it? Because FDR did was
we'd all be speaking German right now. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don.
They immediately went after, when we did enter the war, we went after and I don't know all the specifics, and it's worth drilling down, I think, but we went after when Szilard saw, I'm sort of a Leo Szilard fan, when Szilard saw that the Germans were going after uranium deposits, they're heading towards, I guess it was Petersburg, and they detoured off and took a mountain range, I think in the Urals, but he realized they were going after uranium deposits, and he knew exactly what was going on, and he knew no one would listen to a Hungarian, a small physicist from Hungary with a Hungarian foreign accent. So he went to Einstein, and they recreated, the discussion in a famous photograph after the fact. And Einstein gathered together the top physicists, and they wrote a famous letter to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt did not blink. He immediately started the Manhattan Project. And it was very complicated. There were physicists doing various types of research all over the country at the time, in the world. And they brought it together very quickly. But it was that immediate reaction from Roosevelt that I think saved humanity. And otherwise, Hitler...
Well,
Hitler
arguably. Don, I think you can make a strong case that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not necessary to end the war. Japan was already basically begging for peace terms. But, Harry Truman wanted to prove to the Russians, to the Soviets, that he had something that they should be afraid of. But I get your point, and it's an extraordinary point. And no, I would not expect anything resembling leadership to come from Trump.
Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and the essence of it is, I use a couple of examples. There's hundreds of them out there. In one case, Alabama is preparing to execute a man who was not guilty of the crime that he committed with a relatively high level of certainty, but still they're gonna kill this guy, an African American. And the other story out of New York State, where the police officers hogtied this guy, arms, elbows behind him, tied his legs together, and then threw him down a flight of stairs, mangled his face. He looked he was totally beaten. 12 hours later, he commits suicide in his cell. How is it possible that our prisons do this kind of stuff? Because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is still legal in the United States. You have no rights if you've been convicted of a crime. We need to amend the Constitution. Check it out at thomhartmann.com. I was going to get to this tweet by Donald Trump. This just came down, right? Just at 7:57, I guess that I don't know if Twitter adjusts for specific time or not. But anyhow, this morning Donald Trump tweeted, "Tell the Democrat governors," that would be Democratic. There is no such thing as a Democrat Party. It's, this goes back to some really nasty politicians in the 1950s saying, always call it the Democrat Party, and with the emphasis on the rat. The name of the party is Democratic. Anyhow, tell the Democratic governors that, quote, Mutiny on the Bounty, end quote, was one of my all-time favorite movies. Really? I mean, this was the HMS Bounty, and Captain Bligh was this insane, narcissistic, brutal, sadistic captain of this ship who tortured his own men, killed his own men, tied them to the mast. So anyhow, back to Trump's tweet. Tell the Democrat governors that Mutiny on the Bounty was one of my all-time favorite movies. A good old-fashioned mutiny every now and then is an exciting, invigorating thing to watch, especially when the mutineers need so much from the captain. Too easy, exclamation mark. Do you get how friggin' sick this is? How twisted and sociopathic this is? The president of the United States is saying that he is going to torture the governors of states who are trying to save their own people. Last week I was talking about an interstate compact, end the federal income tax. It's merely a wealth transfer system from blue states to red states. The red states are, Mississippi gets $4 for every dollar they send to Washington, D.C. Why? Just end the federal income tax. Mississippi can do whatever they damn well please.
end the federal income tax, and the individual states can raise their tax rates to 30, 40, 50%, whatever they want, whatever the federal tax would have been otherwise. And then they can provide their citizens with things like Medicare for all and free college education and a good hospital system that can deal with the coronavirus and testing if the states had the money. So anyhow, that was my pitch. Well, now you've got 3 states in the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington State, who are joining with a couple of states on the East Coast and saying, we're going to create a compact, basically, and we're going to decide when we're going to open ourselves back up. Now, keep in mind, Trump never shut the country down, so he can't open it back up. The country is not shut down. You've got 8 states run by Republican governors where their people are really starting to get pissed off and frightened. You got 8 states run by Republican governors where they're doing nothing. But here is the President of the United States saying that he is going to punish the people of those states. He's going to increase the number of dead people in those states because he's unhappy with the fact that they're not acknowledging that his power is absolute. That's what he said yesterday, absolute. And then Mike Pence came out and said, yes, it's plenary. Plenary is a fancy word that means absolute. By the way, March of 2020, the month that just ended, was the first month without a school shooting since 2002. 18 years, the first month without a school shooting. That's the good news. The bad news is that, during that month, Donald Trump killed probably 10, 15,000 people. I don't know what the total death rate for the United States was in March, but the numbers were probably in that neighborhood. So whatever the school shooters didn't do, Donald Trump more than made up for. I think I mentioned earlier that Jill Karofsky, the liberal running for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, won the election yesterday. It happened, the returns came in after I got off the air. We were speculating about it on the air. And she beat Mr. Kelly, Daniel Kelly, Justice, who is sitting on the court right now. So now it's 4-3 conservatives to liberals. And, I don't know if there's any, I'm not all that familiar with Wisconsin's elections. I'm not sure if there's any Supreme Court justices on the ballot in November. But this is telling us what happened in Wisconsin. I mean, these guys, Donald Trump and the Republicans in the legislature and the Republicans on the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin and the federal Supreme Court, all got together and said, we're going to force people to make a choice, your life or your vote. On the assumption that Democrats are more afraid of the coronavirus than Republicans are, because Republicans watch Fox News where they're constantly saying, more people die from the flu. In fact, that's what Brit Hume said yesterday. Well, if we're only going to have 60,000 deaths, we had as many as 61,000 deaths from the flu. So therefore, don't worry, be happy. What are you worried about? Well, that's because we've been sheltering in place for a couple of months. I mean, that's because the blue states did it right. Now wait until these mind-bogglingly incompetent red state governors start dealing with this, which, by the way, as I said, we'll talk about this in the second hour, but I think this is why Trump is literally stealing medical supplies from blue state governors. We'll be back. Do you think he's going to get away with it?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Or do you think that the David Koch, Ronald Reagan 40-year experiment, David Koch is, well, they're both gone now, is going to succeed or fail?
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann. This is from Chapter 3, Hunters in Our Schools and Offices, The Origin of ADHD. The earliest theories about attention deficit disorder characterized it as a diseased state that had to do with brain damage or dysfunction. At various times, it has been lumped in with fetal alcohol syndrome, mental retardation, various genetic mental illnesses, psychiatric disorders resulting from early trauma or childhood abuse, and the theory that parental smoking led to fetal oxygen deprivation. Prior to the 1970s, when ADHD was first characterized as a specific disorder, ADHD children and adults were largely treated simply as bad people, even though attentional deficits have been recognized in the psychological literature since 1905. They were the kids who always got into trouble, the James Deans of the world, the rootless and unsettled adults like Abraham Lincoln's father, the Lone Ranger, or John Dillinger. More recent research, however, has demonstrated a high incidence of ADHD among the parents of ADHD kids. This discovery caused some psychologists to initially postulate that ADHD was the result of growing up in a dysfunctional family. They suggested that ADHD may follow the same pattern as child or spousal abuse, moving through generations as learned behavior. The dietary-causing advocates contended that children's pattern their parents' eating habits, and this accounts for the generational patterns of ADHD. Other studies suggest that, like Down syndrome or muscular dystrophy, ADHD is a genetic disease, and a specific gene, the A1 variant of the D2 dopamine receptor gene, has been identified by scientists as the leading candidate. But if ADHD is a genetic disease or an abnormality, it's a popular one, possibly afflicting as many as 25 million individuals in the United States. Some estimates put ADHD as occurring in 20% of males and 5% of females. Other estimates are much lower, hitting a bottom of 3% of males and 0.5% of females. With such a wide distribution among our population, is it reasonable to assume that ADHD is simply a quirk, that it's some sort of aberration caused by defective genes or child abuse? When the condition is so widely distributed, inevitable questions arise. Why? Where did ADHD come from? The answer is, people with ADHD are the leftover hunters, those whose ancestors evolved and matured thousands of years in the past in hunting societies. There is ample precedent for genetic diseases, in quotes, that in fact represent evolutionary survival strategies. Sickle cell anemia, for example, is now known to make its victims less susceptible to malaria. When living in the jungles of Africa, where malaria is endemic, it was a powerful environmental tool against death by disease. In the malaria-free environment of North America, it became a liability. The same is true of Tay-Sachs disease, a genetic condition that hits mainly Eastern European Jews and confers on them a relative immunity to tuberculosis. And even cystic fibrosis, the deadly genetic disease common among Caucasians, 1 in 25 white Americans carries the gene, may represent a genetic adaptation. Recent research indicates the cystic fibrosis gene helps protect its victims at younger ages from death by such diarrheal diseases as cholera, which periodically swept Europe thousands of years ago. It's not so unusual, apparently, for humans to have built into our genetic material protection against local diseases and other environmental conditions. Certainly, Darwin's theory of natural selection argues in favor of such bodily defenses. Those individuals with immunities would survive to procreate and pass along their genetic material. As the human race moved from its earliest ancestors, two basic types of cultures evolved. In the areas that were lush with plant and animal life and had low human population density, hunters and gatherers predominated. In other parts of the world, particularly Asia, farming or agricultural societies evolved. Be it pursuing buffalo in North America, hunting deer in Europe, chasing wildebeest in Africa, or picking fish from a stream in Asia, these hunters needed a certain set of physical and mental characteristics to be successful. Number one, they constantly monitor their environment. That rustle in the bushes could be a lion or a coiled snake. Failure to be fully aware of the environment and notice that faint sound might mean a swift and painful death. Or that sound or flash of movement might be the animal the hunter was stalking, and noticing it would mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. I've walked through forests and jungles with modern hunter types in the United States, Europe, Australia, and East Africa, and one characteristic always struck me. They notice everything. A flipped-over stone, a tiny footprint, a distant sound, an odd smell in the air, the direction in which flowers point or moss grows. All these things have meaning to hunters, and even when walking quickly, they notice everything. Number two, they can totally throw themselves into the hunt. Time is elastic for them. Another characteristic of a good hunter is the ability to totally focus on the moment, utterly abandoning all consideration of any other time or place. When the hunter sees the prey, he gives chase through gully or ravine, over fields or through trees, giving no thought to the events of the day before, nor not considering the future, simply living totally in that one pure moment and immersing himself in it. When involved in the hunt, time seems to speed. When not in the hunt, time becomes slow. While a hunter's ability to concentrate in general may be low, his ability to utterly throw himself into the hunt at the moment is astonishing. 3, they're flexible, capable of changing strategy on a moment's notice. If the wild boar vanishes into the brush and a rabbit appears, the hunter is off in a new direction. The book ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann.
Coming up on this week's Science Revolution is Zach Corrigan with Food and Water Watch. Could another zoonotic pandemic be coming? Thomas Lindsay with the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights is here on the rights of nature and how they may have kept Pennsylvania from industry harm. And Friends of the Earth, Lucas Ross is dropping by on the big oil bailout and how fracking could be next. Plus, Arthur West with the Washington League for Increased Transparency and Ethics is suing Fox So-Called News for endangering Americans by calling the coronavirus a hoax. Can he win? The Science Revolution is available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you live from Portland, Oregon, and Carol in Morning View, Kentucky. Hey, Carol. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's on your mind today?
The post office. Actually, I'm 72 years old. I'm from Ann Arbor, so I kind of have a liberal bent. And you did such a setup because I think this is a continuation of Reagan and the air traffic controllers, as well as people wanting to get the 75-year fund that's sitting there, that money could be distributed to oligarchs or some dumb thing. It would break the unions in such a way that we won't have communication, physical communication. If they shut down the internet and we can't gather together, this is horrible. But I also think it's being done to shut down your voting by mail. Our vote is important. And I don't know how many states. I know your state. I know Colorado, Washington, California now will depend on it. If they shut down all those states, Hawaii, what are we going to do? And my thought, I still work. I'm 72 years old, and I go into Kroger every day and do cashier work. I have a woman who comes in regularly who's from the local post office, and I asked her, and I've been venting with her for weeks about the post office. But yesterday I asked her, what if we overpay postage? What if, like I have to send a package today, what if I go in and it's $5.40 and I give them $12, but I don't take higher, a higher rate? Does that go to their profit? She said, yes. So I'm thinking, could we set up something as people to show how much we care about this service and actually do a donation? I don't know whether, actually I'd call when Kana or Japai, I can't say her name.
Jayapal. There's a simple answer to your question. Yeah, Carol, there's a very straightforward answer. And in fact, last week when I was ranting about the post office and how these guys are trying to destroy it and why, it's also the largest unionized employer in the United States. That's a large part of why they want to destroy it. I thought about suggesting that people can go to USPS.gov, United States Postal Service, USPS.gov, and you can buy stamps. And you don't have to use those stamps. And if you don't use the stamps, that's pure profit for the post office. It's one of the reasons why over the years the post office has encouraged stamp collecting, because it's pure profit if you don't actually use those stamps. And so, if you wanted to buy $12 worth of stamps and put $5 worth on a package and put the other $7 worth in your back pocket, that would be $7 of profit to the post office. And you'd have stamps that you could use in the future when the crisis is over and we've got a rational Democrat in the White House. Carol, thank you. That it's an excellent question, and your point is really well taken. Over the short term, though, we don't have a rational Democrat in the White House. Barack Obama, by the way, just came out and endorsed Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders yesterday endorsed Joe Biden, and Joe Biden said, "Bernie, help me govern." I mean, this is turning into something good on our side. But right now, you've got a Republican-controlled Senate with Mitch McConnell who wants to privatize the post office. He's dancing to the tune of FedEx, and I'm not sure about UPS. They're unionized, so it would probably be FedEx, and the right-wing billionaires. and you've got, Donald Trump in the White House, and, who hates the post office, and who has just come right out and said, if we have vote by mail, then Democrats are going to win. And in fact, I got an email. Let me see if I can find it here in my stack. I got an email yesterday afternoon, and I printed it out for today's show. I was going to get into it in the second hour, but this is just the perfect moment. Got an email from Adam Brandon, who is with FreedomWorks. FreedomWorks, of course, one of the lead organizations that was, brought into being by the Koch brothers and the Koch network, the guys who led the Tea Party thing. And it's to Barney Rubble. Fred gave $5 to Trump. Barney signed up for FreedomWorks' newsletter. Barney, President Trump is right. Actually, it starts out with a tweet from Donald Trump. Donald J. Trump, mail-in ballots substantially increase the risk of crime and voter fraud. That's what, at the very top, Trump's tweet says that. And then Adam Brandon says, Barney, President Trump is right. Mail-in voting would throw the 2020 election into absolute chaos. That's why Nancy Pelosi and the radical left are doing everything they can to make it happen. In fact, they're trying to sneak it into the next coronavirus spending bill. Stop Nancy Pelosi from stealing the 2020 election now. Barney, if this insidious scheme is enacted, it'd take months to verify election results. Ballots could be stolen and filled out by someone else, and people could be threatened to change their vote. Voting in person on Election Day is the best way to make sure your vote is counted and protect yourself from being targeted and harassed by angry mobs. Oh my God, FreedomWorks is telling me the angry mobs are coming to get me? Oh no, wait a minute. They're telling me that I'm part of the angry mobs. Well, anyhow, that's why we've got to do everything we can to stop that from happening. And Barney, I'm counting on you to help us do it. Please contact your members of Congress. See, this is what's going on to Republicans all across the country. Call Congress. Tell them no vote by mail. This is supported by billionaires. There's unlimited money behind this. Please contact your members of Congress. And it's a hot link, by the way. And it takes you to a page where you can instantly send an email to your member of Congress. You can call. Tell them to stop Pelosi from stealing the 2020 election. Tell them to oppose any efforts to expand mail-in voting. That's what's going all across the United States. So yeah, I'm as PO'd as you are. Michael in Lake Wells, Florida. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I was looking at your original question, and it seems that it goes back even further, and the plan is even greater. Like from Carol Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, where he talks, he had access to all of their documents, and says that the plan is for the central banks to, for financial capitalism, to create a world system of financial control in private hands that could dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, and that the system would be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert.
Yeah, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, Michael. And here's why. First of all, central banks, yes, the Federal Reserve, for example, is owned by its 10-member banks, 10 or 12, and they are privately owned banks. That said, the Federal Reserve actually performs some very important functions. I am not a fan of how it's behaving right now. I think it's setting us up for a worse disaster down the road. But, the whole bankers want to control the world thing, that meme, and this is why I stopped your call and why I don't like to have those kind of calls on the show, is that whole central banker meme is a variation on Hitler's Jewish bankers control the world meme. This was Adolf Hitler's shtick. Was, Jews control the banking? Look at all the names. Rothschild, that must be a Jewish name. The Bilderbergers, that must be well, that's actually a hotel. But, it was all about anti-Semitism. And it still is. Central bankers, coordinate, but it's not some conspiracy to control the world. You want to see the conspiracy, well, it's not even a conspiracy, it's right out in public. Look at what's going on. Look at what went on in 1980. Anyhow, Michael in Bronx, New York. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how you doing? Stay safe, my friend.
I'm well.
And
Thank you.
I have to answer both your questions in one shot because they're kind of connected. All right? Is the Republican plan disintegrating? Oh, yes. And we certainly saw it in 2018 in midterm elections, 2019 governor elections, and I feel there is a blue wave that is rising against all these injustices that these Republicans, particularly Trump, is trying to bestow upon us. Now, as far as Trump trying to punish the blue states, this goes to the election as well, because it's only the Republicans that are stealing the elections. I think I told you before that every time they commit an atrocity, they in turn falsely point the finger to us or to elsewhere just to create a distraction. So what is happening here? He's taking away the ventilators to punish the blue state governors, and then people dying under his watch. Remember I told you before that these Republicans always defend the shooting of unarmed people of color, as well as they're defending the Charlottesville that went on. Anyone and everyone that has demise, that are opponents of Trump or opponents of Republicans, that's less opposition votes for them to have in the face. So
Yeah,
I find
Michael,
that
and
this is Trump's.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I find that this is Trump's plot here. Will it work? No, but I surely hate to see any more casualties result from his dangerous, deadly, and terrorist.
I'm with you, Michael. And this goes beyond just white supremacy. This is oligarchy. This is domination of a political system by billionaires.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
45 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Professor, I know you don't like this kind of stuff, but I got a conspiracy theory for you.
Okay.
Your governor of New York, he's refusing to give Donald Trump a pardon or a pass. So the only people that can lock Donald Trump up are the folks down in New York. And assuming that Mr. Trump does not win in November, he might be looking at the inside of a jail cell in New York, and Mr. Cuomo does not want to give him that pardon. Okay, and then I know this is going to be really crazy. Mr. Trump should be impeached again. When Mr. Obama left the White House, they gave this man a 69-page report on how to prevent pandemic viruses in this country and the world. He completely ignored it. He burned it up like you just light a match to something. And now look at all these people who are suffering and are dying. All this stuff is on his hands. He needs to be impeached for this, in my opinion. Okay, and what he's trying to do here with I have the ultimate authority is he is trying to suspend the elections in November because that fool knows he's busted. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Morris, if it wasn't for the fact that Donald Trump has literally a lifetime of experience in stretching out court processes, in appealing and countersuing, and I mean, this is what he's done his entire life. Deutsche Bank tried to collect on a $600 million loan, and he sued them. He sued his own bank at the same time he was asking them for more money. And they backed off, and they said, okay, fine, you don't have to pay the loan back. Honest to God. And so that informs me that probably Trump's thinking runs something like this. Okay, I leave office in 2020. Now, this is assuming he leaves office. And mark my words, he's going to buy or merge with or create some sort of partnership with One America News Network, OAN, which has become his favorite news network. They're to the right of Fox News. And he's going to form some sort of a partnership with them. Originally, he was going to, when he thought he was going to lose in 2016, he was planning on starting a television network to compete with OAN and to compete with Fox News. But I think he's going to start his own television network after he leaves office in 2020. and become kind of a shadow government. I've been, calling for a shadow cabinet all this time. I think he's going to create a shadow government. And, he's going to continue to dominate the headlines to the extent that he can, unless the news media says, okay, enough of the Trump show. And I think that he thinks that even if they can find, even if New York State, if Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, can find evidence that he committed financial fraud, and by the way, that evidence is laying all over the ground. You'll recall 2 years ago, the New York Times laid out all of his tax frauds with his father's money. And it was so egregious that his sister, who participated in them, who was a federal judge, resigned from the federal bench, basically as a way to get immunity on this thing. So, I think he just figures that he can just bluff his way through it, bluster his way through it. He'll be 75 years old when he retires, as I recall, maybe 74. And, he figures, he can make it another 10, 15 years, until he dies of old age or some disease related to his lifestyle, hamburger, cheeseburger poisoning or something. I don't think he's that worried about it, frankly. I used to think he was very worried about it. I don't think he is now. I think he really believes in his own invincibility. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it, and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Hey, we have a special new video up for supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com. And it's about how FDR in 1944, in fact, January 44, in his State of the Union address, talked about how important it was to add rights to the Bill of Rights. The original Bill of Rights was all political rights. He said it's time to enshrine economic rights in our Constitution. I would add, like most of the governments of Europe have done. And this includes the right to housing, the right to food, the right to a good job that pays well, the right to an education, including a college education, and the right to health care. It is pretty powerful stuff. And frankly, I think that what this coronavirus crisis is proving is that we are all in this together, and that Reagan's thing about government is never going to help you was just a load of crap. And so you can check it out over at thomhartmann.com. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Linda in Coconut Creek, Florida. Hey, Linda, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thank you for your callers about the post office, seeing as I'm a soon-to-be retired postal employee. And
good on you.
Yes, buy stamps. Buy stamps. Call your congressmen, call your senators, and tell them, no, don't you dare touch our post office. That's the only thing in this government that's working. Yeah,
and that number, by the way, is 202-224-3121 to reach your member of Congress. And they're not in their offices right now, but their offices are open, and they many of them anyway, don't, have somebody answering the phone. And if not, even if it's just an answering machine, you can leave a message. Back to you, Linda.
Okay. What I called about was we're going to see all these bailouts, the cruise industry, we're going to see the airline industry, next thing you know, the oil industry. But the thing that bothers me is I see the insurance company industry saying we need a bailout because or surprise billing. We're not going to cover COVID-19 because we didn't plan for that. And either they're going to go bankrupt or you're going to see surprise billing all over this country. One way or the other, they're going to get us because that's how they're losing money right now. They are losing money, and they don't like that. Yeah.
Right. And this is why they're talking about 40% increase in premiums next year.
Exactly. That's what they're going to do. They're going to slip it to you like they did with me with my surprise billing I called you about last summer. And I had won, thanks to my wonderful congressman and my union. But I see this going to be, you know what? People got to wake up, because if we don't get health care this time around, we're never going to get Medicare for all. We're just not going to. There's just no possible way we're going to get it. You know, that's all I had to say, Tom. Thanks, and be safe.
It's a good one, Linda. Thank you. Thanks for the call. Steve in Machias, Washington. Hey, Steve, what's up?
That's Machias.
Machias, okay.
Yes. Okay, I got this thing from the post, a postcard addressed to postal customer that reads, President Trump's coronavirus guidelines for America. This is...
Right, those went out a week or so ago. Yeah.
This looks more like a campaign literature than a warning to...
That's what it is?
Well...
I mean, it's paid for with your tax dollars, right? But that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, it's really inappropriate. Do
you have that card in front of you, Steve?
Absolutely.
Look on the address side and look in the upper right-hand corner. Does it say, postage paid, or is there the president's signature?
Postage fees paid, USPS permit number G10.
Okay. Well, that's good news, actually. That means they didn't use franking to send that letter out. They actually paid for it with your tax dollars. But the post office actually got some benefit from it. But yeah, we talked about those last week or the week before last, actually. I think when they first went out. It's in fact the point that I made was I remember back in 2001, or maybe it was early 2002, when Bernie Sanders shamed the Republicans and said, if you're going to do a massive, it was, this giant bailout bill after 9/11 because the economy was in the tank. And Bernie Sanders says, if you're going to do a giant bailout bill for the big corporations and the billionaires, at least give $300 to everybody in the country, right? You get a stimulus check. And that $300 check came along with a little letter that said, George W. Bush is very happy to give you this $300. No mention of Bernie at all. Bush had opposed it. The Republicans had opposed it. But Bernie finally humiliated them to the point where they pretty much had to do it. And this is the same thing. It's not that Bush opposed it, but this is just another opportunity for a Republican president to put his name in front of everybody using the mail. And the mail, of course, also, if you are a registered voter, you're far more likely to get your mail every day than if you're not, because people who move a lot or people who are not registered to vote, they're less likely to have, good, consistent, solid, reliable mail service. So, it should not surprise us that Trump is doing the same thing every night on television. He's using the White House he's getting a couple $100 million a day worth of free television time. And, I guess the good thing from our point of view is that he's so incompetent and so psychopathic, and we'll be talking with Dr. Bandy Lee about this in the third hour, that it is actually in some areas hurting him, but which, should be cold comfort, because if the next Republican president is just a little bit smarter and a little less psychotic than Donald Trump, and they use the same techniques that Donald Trump is using, we will end up an oligarchy, or even worse, a tyrannical dictatorship. I mean, that it will be turned, the power of government will be turned on us. And just like Trump is talking right now about turning the power of government on the states, on the Democratic governors. It's an amazing time. It's just an absolutely amazing time. So anyhow, in our second hour, how much damage can Trump actually do to blue state governors? And we also have Paul Ryan, not the congressman, the vice president of Common Cause, on to talk about the Constitution and presidential power right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and the essence of it is, I used a couple of examples. There's hundreds of them out there. In one case, Alabama is preparing to execute a man who was not guilty of the crime that he committed with a relatively high level of certainty, but still they're gonna kill this guy, an African American. And the other story out of New York State, where the police officers hogtied this guy, arms, elbows behind him, tied his legs together, and then threw him down a flight of stairs, mangled his face. He looked he was totally beaten. 12 hours later, he commits suicide in his cell. How is it possible that our prisons do this kind of stuff? Because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is still legal in the United States. You have no rights if you've been convicted of a crime. We need to amend the Constitution. Check it out at thomhartmann.com. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann. This is from Chapter 3, Hunters in Our Schools and Offices, The Origin of ADHD. The earliest theories about attention deficit disorder characterized it as a diseased state that had to do with brain damage or dysfunction. At various times, it has been lumped in with fetal alcohol syndrome, mental retardation, various genetic mental illnesses, psychiatric disorders resulting from early trauma or childhood abuse, and the theory that parental smoking led to fetal oxygen deprivation. Prior to the 1970s, when ADHD was first characterized as a specific disorder, ADHD children and adults were largely treated simply as bad people, even though attentional deficits have been recognized in the psychological literature since 1905. They were the kids who always got into trouble, the James Deans of the world, the rootless and unsettled adults like Abraham Lincoln's father, the Lone Ranger, or John Dillinger. More recent research, however, has demonstrated a high incidence of ADHD among the parents of ADHD kids. This discovery caused some psychologists to initially postulate that ADHD was the result of growing up in a dysfunctional family. They suggested that ADHD may follow the same pattern as child or spousal abuse, moving through generations as learned behavior. The dietary-causing advocates contended that children's their parents' eating habits, and this accounts for the generational patterns of ADHD. Other studies suggest that, like Down syndrome or muscular dystrophy, ADHD is a genetic disease, and a specific gene, the A1 variant of the D2 dopamine receptor gene, has been identified by scientists as the leading candidate. But if ADHD is a genetic disease or an abnormality, it's a popular one, possibly afflicting as many as 25 million individuals in the United States. Some estimates put ADHD as occurring in 20% of males and 5% of females. Other estimates are much lower, hitting a bottom of 3% of males and 0.5% of females. With such a wide distribution among our population, is it reasonable to assume that ADHD is simply a quirk, that it's some sort of aberration caused by defective genes or child abuse? When the condition is so widely distributed, inevitable questions arise. Why? Where did ADHD come from? The answer is, people with ADHD are the leftover hunters, those whose ancestors evolved and matured thousands of years in the past in hunting societies. There is ample precedent for genetic diseases, in quotes, that in fact represent evolutionary survival strategies. Sickle cell anemia, for example, is now known to make its victims less susceptible to malaria. When living in the jungles of Africa, where malaria is endemic, it was a powerful environmental tool against death by disease. In the malaria-free environment of North America, it became a liability. The same is true of Tay-Sachs disease, a genetic condition that hits mainly Eastern European Jews and confers on them a relative immunity to tuberculosis. And even cystic fibrosis, the deadly genetic disease common among Caucasians, 1 in 25 white Americans carries the gene, may represent a genetic adaptation. Recent research indicates the cystic fibrosis gene helps protect its victims at younger ages from death by such diarrheal diseases as cholera, which periodically swept Europe thousands of years ago. It's not so unusual, apparently, for humans to have built into our genetic material protection against local diseases and other environmental conditions. Certainly, Darwin's theory of natural selection argues in favor of such bodily defenses. Those individuals with immunities would survive to procreate and pass along their genetic material. As the human race moved from its earliest ancestors, two basic types of cultures evolved.
In the areas that were lush with plant and animal life and had low human population density, hunters and gatherers predominated. In other parts of the world, particularly Asia, farming or agricultural societies evolved. Be it pursuing buffalo in North America, hunting deer in Europe, chasing wildebeest in Africa, or picking fish from a stream in Asia, these hunters needed a certain set of physical and mental characteristics to be successful. Number one, they constantly monitor their environment. That rustle in the bushes could be a lion or a coiled snake. Failure to be fully aware of the environment and notice that faint sound might mean a swift and painful death. Or that sound or flash of movement might be the animal the hunter was stalking, and noticing it would mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. I've walked through forests and jungles with modern hunter types in the United States, Europe, Australia, and East Africa, and one characteristic always struck me. They notice everything. A flipped over stone, a tiny footprint, a distant sound, an odd smell in the air, the direction in which flowers point or moss grows. All these things have meaning to hunters, and even when walking quickly, they notice everything. Number two, they can totally throw themselves into the hunt. Time is elastic for them. Another characteristic of a good hunter is the ability to totally focus on the moment, utterly abandoning all consideration of any other time or place. When the hunter sees the prey, he gives chase through gully or ravine, over fields or through trees, giving no thought to the events of the day before, nor not considering the future, simply living totally in that one pure moment and immersing himself in it. When involved in the hunt, time seems to speed. When not in the hunt, time becomes slow. While a hunter's ability to concentrate in general may be low, his ability to utterly throw himself into the hunt at the moment is astonishing. Three, they're flexible, capable of changing strategy on a moment's notice. If the wild boar vanishes into the brush and a rabbit appears, the hunter is off in a new direction. The book ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann. British allies scarred the French soil, the polar bear expedition.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Donald Trump is playing some kind of a game here with medical supplies, and the country has not yet figured it out. And I have a feeling that when the country does figure it out, because I have a pretty strong feeling, now again, this is just, looking at what's going on, but a pretty strong feeling that what the Trump administration is doing right now is they're trying to seize, and they literally are seizing. People are getting shipments. Like there's one state that had negotiated with a company in China for a chartered FedEx airplane full of personal protective equipment. And that state's governor, I'm not going to name the state here because they're trying to keep it on the QT, but that state's governor has mobilized the National Guard to meet that plane, and I believe it's supposed to be arriving today, to meet that plane when it touches down in the United States to prevent federal officials from stealing the contents of that plane. Now, this is happening all around the country in blue states, where supplies are arriving and then they're being stolen by the federal government. I mean, literally at gunpoint. You will give this to us. We are the federal government. While Captain Bligh, Donald Trump asserts his absolute authority over the states. He is literally taking supplies, personal protective equipment, respirators, ventilators, pharmaceuticals, literally taking these things out of the hands of states and putting them somewhere. Now, I personally believe that he's building a personal little stockpile for two groups. Number one, for the red state governors. We know Ron DeSantis got everything he asked for. The governor of Nebraska got more than he asked for. The governor of Indiana got more than he asked for. I mean, red states are getting all kinds of goodies. Blue states, not so much. Nebraska and Montana, for example, are getting $300,000. Now, this is not supplies, this is money, but, federal assistance, $300,000 per COVID case. New York is getting $12,000 per COVID case. Who's getting $300,000? Oh, Nebraska and Montana. What party are their governors? Oh, Republicans, yes. And who's getting $12,000 a case? New York State. And these are numbers confirmed by HHS. But they are literally hijacking these things. And I think, number one, he's stashing them to pass along to red states when the crisis gets bad in the red states, because they have to know it's coming. Just like back in November of last year, the spy agencies were telling Trump there's something nasty going on in Wuhan. Throughout December, the spy agencies and the Department of Health and Human Services was telling Donald Trump there's something going on in Wuhan. It was New Year's Eve, January 31st or December 31st, when the Chinese government officially announced what was going on. And then it became knowledge for the world. That was the end of last year, the last day of last year. 3 weeks later, on January 20th, we had our first case here in the United States. Throughout all of January, Donald Trump was saying, "Don't worry, it's all good. Be happy." He was going golfing. He was lying through his teeth. I mean, this is what was going on, and throughout January, throughout February, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks of March. And during that critical time, hundreds of thousands of people were infected. Actually, millions of Americans were infected. And those, it's a 3-4 week period between the time that the infection occurs and the person shows up in a hospital or goes on a ventilator. Between the time that they die. So we're just now seeing, over the last week or two, the results in New York City of infections that happened 3, 4, 5 weeks ago when Trump was doing diddly squat. And the infections are slowly moving across the rest of, well, not slowly, it depends on your time scale, I suppose, but the infections are moving across the United States. And they are going to be ultimately in Montana and Nebraska and South Dakota, where the governor is, she's all really excited, right? Because she's starting a clinical trial of hydrochloroquine to prevent COVID-19. Yes, the drug that causes heart attacks, the drug that Brazil stopped using because it causes heart attacks, the drug that the CIA's own website says, don't take this, it causes heart attacks. That drug, chloroquine, she's going to start giving to perfectly healthy people and see if they don't catch the coronavirus. And who told her this was a good idea? Well, she said several times during her news conference, it was Jared Kushner, that medical expert who goes to his brother's friend who's a doctor, who goes to Facebook and asks questions on behalf of Jared. What's the best practices for COVID? Remember this? Jared Kushner actually getting information from a Facebook group that some guy who's remotely related to him or friends of his, plays in, some guy who's a doctor. And that was the sheet that got passed out by the White House a week or so ago about here's our best practices. Right. So anyhow, Trump is playing some kind of angle with this. And I think that this is why he's trying to assert his absolute authority, so he can continue to give the red states whatever they want and screw the blue states. And, sadly for Donald Trump, the blue states on the West Coast got their act together back when he was still dithering and playing golf and whining on Fox News. The blue states shut, Oregon, Washington State, and California shut it down. And so none of these 3 states are seeing the explosion of cases right now. Now, we're expecting a larger number of cases One of my kids works in the biggest hospital here in Portland. Says that they're anticipating sometime in May that we're going to hit some sort of a peak. But how bad that peak is going to be? Probably not anywhere near as bad as New York, because we've had shelter in place now for a month. San Francisco's had it even longer, the Bay Area. So, Trump can bluster all he wants, but, we did the right thing. But anyhow, there's something skeezy going on here. And to top it all off, this is mind-boggling. Where did it go? We just discovered that Donald Trump, that the Republicans, this $1,200, you're getting your $1,200 check. Well, $90 billion in tax breaks are built into this $2 trillion stimulus, and over 80% of it is going to 43,000 families in America who make more than $1 million a year. It's going to cost us $90 billion this year, $170 billion over 10 years, 82%, this via the Associated Press, 82% of the benefits of the policy go to roughly 43,000 Americans who earn more than $1 million a year. Fewer than 3% of the benefits go to Americans who earn less than $100,000 a year. So 3% of the benefit of the $2 trillion bailout is going to us. That's probably those $1,200 checks. 82% is going to the 43,000 millionaires in America. Aren't you happy?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And then on top of that, Lindsey Graham is saying, hey, we've got to cut back on this rich unemployment benefit. We got to cut $9 an hour out of this stuff. It's too much money. And welcome back. Boy, what a day, huh? What a day. Ben in Hood River, Oregon. Hey, Ben, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I actually wrote down a question and a comment so I would be succinct. Given his obsession with glorifying the past, projecting military strength, and othering non-white immigrants, now with his absolute authority statement, has Trump gone full mask-off fascist? And if so, what can we do about that? And my comment is in reference to that polar bear expedition piece you were just reading, which is interesting to me because it sounds really heroic when in reality it was a coalition of capitalist nations invading Russia to put down their workers' revolution, which is a little bit different slant on it. And
yeah,
also
I don't, Ben,
general...
I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly which book I was reading that you're talking about. We recorded those book reports a long
it's the
time
polar
ago.
bear, the polar bear expedition.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Sorry about it. Anyway, has Trump gone full mask-off fascist? That's the important question.
Yes, he has.
And what do we do?
He has from day one. I mean, he has always been a fascist. I don't think the guy's literally ever read the Constitution. I think I don't think he has the attention span or the IQ, frankly, to read it and understand it. And he doesn't have the attention span to sit down and have somebody explain it to him. So yeah, he's the only thing that's saving us, frankly, Ben, is that he's not that bright. If this and that he only surrounds himself with family and sycophants. If he was a smarter, cleverer, man, if he was capable, if he actually had some leadership capabilities, we'd be screwed.
Right.
I mean, look at Viktor Orban. What Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. That's where we would be at if Donald Trump had any competence at all. But in answer to your question, yes, full on, total dictator. Liz in California. Hey, Liz, what's up?
Hi. I know.
Liz, I can't hear you. I'm going to put you back on hold, and you can work that out with Joyce. Jared in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jared, what's up?
Hello, Tom. Haven't talked to you in a while. I've been working like crazy at my local pharmacy, dealing with all this corona nonsense. It really has changed our society around here in Pennsylvania. It's kind of amazing how how things have changed so fast. And the Trump supporters, they either think that it's a hoax, or the one Trump supporter I work with thinks actually he's fighting the coronavirus and he's actually doing a really great job. And
you mean he has it?
No, that he's fighting the coronavirus and that he's.
Oh, he thinks that Trump is fighting the coronavirus.
And that he's doing.
I thought you meant the guy you worked with was fighting it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that he's, and he's doing a super job, and this is all China's fault, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the mantra of Fox News, so of course.
Yeah, well, of course, that's where he gets his news from. But but the thing is, though, I don't get is why is it we have not just gone on a complete general strike at this point if he tries to get people back to work?
Because a third of us are out of work right now. I mean, we're looking at a huge economic disaster. This is actually going to be worse than the Great Depression. Maybe a lot shorter, but it's going to be worse.
Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and the essence of it is, I use a couple of examples. There's hundreds of them out there. In one case, Alabama is preparing to execute a man who was not guilty of the crime that he committed with a relatively high level of certainty, but still they're gonna kill this guy, an African American. And the other story out of New York State where the police officers hogtied this guy, elbows behind him, tied his legs together, and then threw him down a flight of stairs, mangled his face. He looked he was totally beaten. 12 hours later, he commits suicide in his cell. How is it possible that our prisons do this kind of stuff? Because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is still legal in the United States. You have no rights if you've been convicted of a crime. We need to amend the Constitution. Check it out at thomhartmann.com.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And let's see here. Robert in Grays Lake, Illinois. Hey, Robert, what's on your mind today?
Okay, I haven't called in a while, but I'm totally on board with that little comment you made about states having to marshal their what is it?
They're calling up the National Guard to stop the feds from stealing their supplies. I mean, it's breathtaking what's going on.
But my comment, I got 3 points to make. Number one, yes, we are ebbing into a fascist state. There's no two ways about it. Anybody that's a decent historian about what happened in Germany, we're witnessing it. Another recent indication that that it's accelerating is Barr put forward to Congress a proposal that in essence eviscerates the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment and would permit the government to pick up anybody, not be presented for an arraignment indefinitely. It's the American version of renditioning that was done abroad. Now, what I think is the tactical thing that people have to start to seize on, that the Democratic Party has given to the Republican Party, is the Second Amendment. And the reason I say that, I've been a gun owner all my life, and I've been progressive my entire life. The actual potency that I gain when I get around a Republican and they realize that I shoot and I don't got a problem with the Second Amendment, they're like, they almost can't talk. They get so disoriented because they're so convinced that they can continually use the Second Amendment to intimidate Democrats, and that's exactly what they do. And I'm hoping that the Democratic Party wakes up and says, enough. The Second Amendment was given to us, though maybe it was misused by the southern states, it was given to us to stand as a buffer between a tyrant. And if Democrats started to realize, hey, if I'm a gun owner, that puts fear in Republicans, because then they realize it's kind of like, I can't bully these people around as easily because maybe they
or
won't
if not
take
fear,
it
at least. If not fear, at least respect. I get it, Robert, and good on you. And I'm glad that you found a wedge into those kinds of arguments. Thank you for the call. By the way, the law that was passed in Germany after the Reichstag was burned that gave Hitler, it was some time after the Reichstag was burned, that gave Hitler the absolute power. The enabling acts, FYI, and I remember that because I wrote several pieces back in 2002 or 3 saying that was what the Patriot Act was, and I still think it is. I think that all of this fascist landscape was set up basically by the George W. Bush administration. Dave in Goodman, Wisconsin, and ironically now you've got Dick Cheney's daughter complaining about Trump trying to be a dictator. That's so rich. Dave in Goodman, Wisconsin, what's on your mind, Dave?
Yeah, greetings from snowy northern Wisconsin. I don't know if you heard about this, but Donald Trump is suing this obscure small TV station in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, for running this ad. I believe it was Priorities USA. They were chronicling all his mishandling of the pandemic crisis from his own words, using all his own words. The only controversy was when they used the word hoax, which I guess was taken a little out of context, but still, but he's suing this small TV station. I don't understand why. But the same TV station,
he's trying to intimidate them.
Talking about
this is what he's done his whole life, Dave. He would sue his contractors. He would sue, anybody he owed a lot of money to and he didn't want to pay, he would sue them. He uses lawsuits. He was in the middle of 3,000 lawsuits when he was running for president. He uses lawsuits to intimidate people, and that's why he's suing that NBC TV station in northern Wisconsin.
To put it in context, Tom, this station runs probably 3-to-1 Republican ads that just sing his praises, so they're not biased.
Right.
Hello?
Yeah. No, this is Donald Trump trying to control the narrative as we head for the election. That's what's going on, Dave. Dave, thanks for the heads up on that. Liz in California, in Los Angeles. Hey, Liz, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I've noticed on the late night shows lately, it says about 2 weeks ago, and to the present, that calling Trump a liar. And then just this week, I've noticed even on CNN and MSNBC, they either delineate the lies or they call him an outright liar. So there's a change in the country, the big news.
I agree, Liz. I agree. They were using the word propaganda in their chyrons yesterday on CNN.
Oh, really? I missed that one.
Yeah. Yeah, they literally said, Trump plays propaganda video. That was the chyron, or it had those, it might have had a few more words than that in it. I'm doing it from memory, but it said Trump, words to the effect of Trump plays propaganda video. And now you're hearing reporters, Wolf Blitzer, people like that, just, use the L word, the lie word. It's really breathtaking. Liz, thank you. Spot on. I think that a change is happening, is coming, is here, frankly. I think the American people are sick of the Trump show. I think they're sick of being lied to. They're sick of being gaslighted. 15,000 lies in 3 years, enough already. We don't want this grifter. We don't want his grifter family. We don't want his grifter son-in-law.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with more of your calls. Do you think that Trump is going to get away with this? And how much damage might he do to the blue states? Oh, actually, we've got a constitutional scholar right after the break, too.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Measuring What Counts, the Global Movement for Well-Being by Joe Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fatoussi, and Martine Duran. And this is from the first chapter labeled Overview. The high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, also known as HLEG, builds on the analyses and recommendations of the 2009 Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, also known as the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, in highlighting the role of well-being metrics in policy and encouraging a more active dialogue among economic theory and statistical practice. The report makes explicit the often implicit assumptions hidden in statistical practices and their real-world consequences. Its central message is that what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong thing, we will do the wrong thing. If we don't measure something, it becomes neglected, as if the problem didn't exist. There is no simple way of representing every aspect of well-being in a single number in the way GDP describes market economic output. This has led to GDP being used as a proxy for both economic welfare, like people's command over commodities, and general welfare, which also depends on people's attributes and non-market activities. GDP was not designed for this task. We need to move beyond GDP when assessing a country's health and complement GDP with a broader dashboard of indicators that would reflect the distribution of well-being in society and its sustainability across the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Excuse me. The challenge is to make the dashboard small enough to be easily comprehensible, but large enough to summarize what we care about the most. The 2008 crisis and its aftermath illustrate why a change in perspective is needed. The GDP loss that followed the crisis was not the temporary one-off event predicted by conventional macroeconomic models. Its effects have lasted over time, suggesting that the crisis caused the permanent loss of significant amounts of capital, not just machines and structures, but also hidden capital in the form of lower on-the-job training, permanent scars on young people entering the labor market during a recession, and lower trust in an economic system rigged to benefit a few. Different metrics, including better measurements of people's economic insecurity, could have shown that the consequences of the recession were much deeper than the GDP statistics indicated, and governments might have responded more strongly to mitigate the negative impacts of the crisis. If, on the basis of GDP, the economy is perceived to be well on the road to recovery, as many governments believed in 2010, one would not take the strong policy measures needed to support people's living conditions suggested by metrics that inform on whether most of the population still feels in recession. Nor would one take measures to bolster the safety net and social protection in the absence of metrics on the extent of people's economic insecurity. These failings in the policy responses to the crisis were compounded by overly focusing on the consequences of public spending in raising government's liabilities, when this spending could take the form of investment, increasing the assets in governments and countries' balance sheets. The same follows when measures of unemployment do not reflect the full extent of a country's unused labor resources. The beyond GDP agenda is sometimes characterized as anti-growth, but this is not the case. The use of a dashboard of indicators reflecting what we value as a society would have led, most likely, to stronger GDP growth than that actually achieved by most countries after 2008. This book also looks at progress in implementing the recommendations of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission since 2009, identifying areas that require increased focus by statistical agencies, researchers, and policymakers. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by the international community in 2015, clearly go far beyond GDP. But their 169 policy targets and more than 200 indicators for global monitoring are too many to guide policies. Countries will have to identify their priorities within the broader UN agenda and upgrade their statistical capacities, which, even in developed countries, are insufficient to monitor whether the agreed-upon commitments are being met. The international community should invest in upgrading the statistical capacity of developing countries, especially in areas where country data are needed to assess global phenomena, such as climate change or the world distribution of income. Inequality in income and wealth has today a central role in policy discussions in ways it did not in 2009. But important progress is still needed in a range of areas, such as measuring what happens at both ends of the income distribution, integrating different data sources, and measuring the joint distribution of income, consumption, and wealth at the individual level. When looking at inequality, it's also important to look at differences between groups. These are called horizontal inequalities, at inequalities within households, and the way resources are shared and managed, which are especially important in the case of wealth. We should also look beyond inequality in outcomes to inequality of opportunity. Inequality of opportunity is even more unacceptable than inequality of outcomes. But the operational distinction between the two is fuzzy, as we don't observe all circumstances that shape people's outcomes and are independent of their efforts. The book Measuring What Counts by Joe Stiglitz and friends. Thank you.
Coming up on this week's Science Revolution is Zach Corrigan with Food and Water Watch. Could another zoonotic pandemic be coming? Thomas Lindsay with the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights is here on the rights of nature and how they may have kept Pennsylvania from industry harm. And Friends of the Earth, Lucas Ross is dropping by on the big oil bailout and how fracking could be next. Plus, Arthur West with the Washington League for Increased Transparency and Ethics is suing Fox So-Called News for endangering Americans by calling the coronavirus a hoax. Can he win? The Science Revolution is available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So where is the legal authority that Trump is claiming to say that basically, he's dictator. He can tell the states what to do. He can force them to open for business. He can force them to close for business. It's entirely up to him. Over on the CDC's website, cdc.gov/quarantine/about laws, regulations, quarantine, something else, you will find legal authorities for isolation and quarantine under federal law, under Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, U.S. 42 U.S. Code 264, the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services is authorized to take measures to prevent the entry and spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries and between states. Now, that's not opening up or shutting down a state. That's basically stopping people at the borders if they show up on a plane or on a ship. And then they go on to say, this is again the CDC's website, states have police power functions to protect the health, safety, and welfare of persons within their borders, to control the spread of diseases within their borders. States have laws to enforce the use of isolation and quarantine, as do tribes. And then they note the last large-scale isolation and quarantine that was enforced in the United States was in the flu pandemic of 1918-1919. So what does all this mean and what do we do with it? Paul Ryan is on the line, Paul S. Ryan, the good Paul Ryan, not the guy who is the Speaker of the House. This Paul Ryan is the Vice President of Policy and Litigation at Common Cause. CommonCause.org is the website. His Twitter handle is the Paul S. Ryan, or at Common Cause. Paul, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So what's, tell us about the 10th Amendment. Tell us about what Trump's powers are and aren't. I don't know if you saw Trump's tweet from a few hours ago where he basically said his favorite movie was Mutiny on the Bounty. He was comparing himself to Captain Bligh, in the HMS Bounty. Who was a brutal psychopathic torturer and sadist. It's just breathtaking. Anyhow, Paul, what's going on here?
Well, there are a lot of layers here. For starters, you mentioned the 10th Amendment, so I'll start there. The 10th Amendment states that powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states. They're possessed by the states, not by the federal government, not by the president. So that's one underlying piece of very important law. Also underlying that provision in the Constitution are general principles of federalism, that we have state governments, we have a federal government. The federal government is of limited power. It can only do, again, as the 10th Amendment states, it can only do what the Constitution says it can do, and states get to make all of the other decisions. That being said, that we have a federal government of limited powers, there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to the full extent of a president's powers in a state of emergency. There are a set of documents that are often referred to as presidential emergency action documents, and these are
classified documents. Public doesn't know what is in them, and unfortunately, it seems Congress doesn't even know what's in these documents. These have existed and they've been amended and changed over decades, but they've existed for decades, going back at least to the Eisenhower administration. And one of the things that would be great to
goes
see
back to the Cold War,
now,
right? These were designed for nuclear war.
Yeah, and they've been amended over the decades periodically. And Congress really needs to be getting access to these documents, maintaining the classification of these documents, but reviewing them. And there is a lot of uncertainty as to the constitutionality of the various powers contemplated in these documents, if they were to be rolled out by the president. But I think the bigger point here, the most important point, is as a practical matter, what does President Trump really think he's going to do? He's been standing on the sidelines as the states have been begging for some sort of national level coordination. He's refused to provide that leadership. There's been a leadership vacuum, and it is the states, the governors and mayors, that have taken leadership on this issue, that have declared or issued stay-at-home orders, and dozens and dozens and dozens of executive orders in states all over the country affecting many aspects of government and public life. And the president, as a practical matter, I can't imagine how he could order private employers to demand to reopen and to demand that their employees come back to work. Much of this is not in the hands not only of governors, but also of private business owners. I work for a nonprofit but private entity, Common Cause, and our president, in consultation with our board of directors and with our management team, back in early March, started contemplating how we would close, when we would close, or not close, but shift to work from home, remote work arrangements. These are the types of decisions that are made by business executives and state and local officials. I'm not sure what the president thinks he can do to change or intervene in that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that he has emergency powers that members of Congress don't even know about that are classified, because a couple of days ago, he made a claim that I thought was way underreported, where he said essentially, I have a lot of power, more power than you guys realize. Or words to that effect. I don't have the quote right in front of me, but it was words to that effect. And I was like, really? Is he just imagining this? But it sounds like maybe he does.
Well, the important thing to underscore when it comes to these presidential emergency action documents that outline these powers, these are, you might call them hypothetical powers, powers that might be asserted or could be asserted. They are largely untested as a matter of law. And if the president attempted to exert these powers, there would, to the extent they were controversial, then they would be litigated. We would be counting on our Congress to check the president's assertion of power or attempts to exercise powers, the courts to check the president's exercise of powers, as well as state and local officials to do the same. So it's not a given that just because he says he has the powers, he has those powers. The possession of powers by the president is something that would be determined under our system of laws by checks from other branches of government, including, importantly, checks from Congress and the courts.
Yeah, fascinating. Is there anything, the CDC's website quotes the Public Health Service Act, Section 361 of 42 U.S. Codes 264, as giving, the federal government certain powers with regard to borders and between states, and I think that kind of complies with the Commerce Clause and some other parts of the Constitution that basically, define the federal role, but or even for that matter, Article 3, Section 2 that defines the Supreme Court's role, dispute between the states. But is there any law that that's known? It's not one of these classified documents that gives the president the power to, number one, force a state to control their commerce, and I'm thinking of the Commerce Clause, to control their commerce in one particular way or another, basically open or closed. Well, let's start there.
Well, I guess my answer would be sort of, which is to say that
there have been many laws passed by Congress and signed by the president over the decades that have directly impacted commerce within states, not necessarily or not limited to commerce between the states. One body of law that springs to mind immediately is civil rights laws. They're largely rooted in the Commerce Clause, but they had to do with and rooted in the idea that interstate travel principles, for example. But here, what we're talking about is a president asserting or threatening to assert powers that have not been granted by Congress through duly enacted statutes. So yes, there are statutes that in some ways directly impact how business is conducted within states.
Thank you for the reminder on that, Paul. And we just have a minute till we're going to hit the break here. But I believe it was Bobby Kennedy when he was Attorney General who said that the lunch counters in the South, because they served Heinz ketchup, which was made in Pennsylvania, those individual lunch counters were engaged in interstate commerce, and therefore he could send in federal troops to enforce integration. Am I remembering that right? And if he could use that expansively, why can't Trump?
Well, your recollection does sound correct to me, but I think it boils down to exactly what Trump tries to do and whether it can be tethered to interstate commerce in some reasonable fashion. But again, when it came to civil rights laws, Congress was involved. This wasn't just the president acting. This was the president acting in coordination with Congress. And what we need now more than anything is a unified response between Congress and the White House and state and local governments against this pandemic, not unnecessary distractions and division.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Paul S. Ryan, the good Paul Ryan, he's the Vice President for Policy and Litigation at Common Cause. CommonCause.org is the website. You can tweet him at Paul S. Ryan. Paul, thanks so much for dropping by today. Great having you with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure being with you.
My pleasure. Great talking to you again. Have a great afternoon. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And just a reminder at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking to the author of one of the books about Donald Trump and his psychology, shall we say? And welcome back. Steve in Darien, Illinois. Hey, Steve, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's on your mind? Steve? Oh, my. I'm going to put Steve on hold here, Joyce, because he's been on hold for a while there, and he's on line 2. Steve's on line 2. Norma in Montgomery, Alabama. Hey, Norma, what's on your mind today?
Well, of course, Trump and his authoritarian attitudes. One of the things that I don't hear anyone mentioning is the fact that Mitch McConnell has been extremely busy appointing judges at every level across the country. And most of these are coming off of your Federalist Society list. And if Trump continues the way he's going, and he even, say, suspends the election and makes himself the dictator, we could lose the Constitution. And I don't see anybody who's even concerned about this, because if they have the courts, how do we even present our arguments that this is what Trump is doing is illegal, and that what he is doing is undermining democracy and undermining the Constitution, and he can do whatever he wants to in January?
That was my big concern when Paul Ryan said that, Trump will appeal this, or, states can appeal these things. And I was thinking, okay, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts, I'm not having a good feeling about this, basically.
Yes, and are they willing to give up the country to maintain their position and support their great leader? This has to end.
I think the answer is yes.
Well, yes, okay, so have we already lost?
Yes.
Have we already lost, or are we the people going to do something?
I think the option of armed revolution is not one that America wants. We went through that with the Civil War.
No, it isn't.
Or that anybody takes seriously outside of the fever dreams of the people who've read Turner Diaries. The hardcore right-wing white supremacists. But I fully expect, Norma, that in November, look at what just happened in Wisconsin. I think in November we are going to see a blowout. I really do.
Well, I hope so. I hope that we are allowed to have this election. I hope that these primaries are allowed to have mail-in ballots, even though Trump says that that's terrible, and that these people are all liars and cheats and frauds and thieves stealing votes. But how can we even begin when Mitch McConnell has essentially taken over the entire judicial system of the country? Where do we start?
Mm-hmm. What is your situation in Alabama with regard to your ability to vote in November, Norma?
Well, right now they have postponed the primary. It was supposed to be in March, and now they're talking about June. And so this primary is for Democrats and Republicans. And, we have, at least Roy Moore is not on the ballot anymore, but we have the Senate. Mm-hmm. We need to keep Doug Jones. And people forget that this primary would also, Bradley Byrne, who was a representative, he still is until January, ran for the Senate seat and lost. And so we have a football player of a coach running for it against Doug Jones. But it's supposed to be our primary sometime this summer, and I don't know when that's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, Norma, thank you. Thanks for the information, and good talking with you as always. We'll be right back, and please stay safe, Norma. It's 10 minutes before the hour. We'll be right back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it, and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Ed in Klamath Falls, Oregon. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Tom, a few years ago, I pointed out to you that the National Emergency Act allows the president to suspend the Constitution in times of national emergency. He may well do it.
Well, it allows him to suspend certain constitutional rights, like due process, I believe. But every act has to operate within the Constitution. You can't suspend the entire Constitution. You couldn't pass a law that suspends the entire Constitution, because
that was the report that I heard back in about 1981. I heard the announcement that the last bit of the law had been tuned up to allow the president to suspend every provision of the Constitution in case of national emergency, like a nuclear war.
Well, Ed, find that provision in the law and call me back and share it with me. I would love to see it. I am skeptical. Janelle in Miami, Florida. Hey, Janelle, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I'm skeptical also. It's just that the Americans are panicked. I can hear the panic in his voice. If we had a reasonable Justice Department, we would all feel a lot better. It would, be clear. But I actually called to make a point about just the post office, and just tell me if I'm right about this. When I'm in line sometime and people are complaining about the length of time they're waiting, I say the post office is the only company that has to fully fund their pension system each year. No other company is required to do that, and they would be out of business if they did. And so it can't make money. There's just no way it can make money.
Well, it's not just that they have to fully fund their pension system. They have to set aside $5 billion every year and put it in a fund with the big New York banks that will be used to pay for the health benefits of retired postal workers starting 75 years from 2006 when the law was passed. So they have to...
Unbelievable.
And they did this. Yeah, the Republicans in Congress and the Bush administration did this because the post office had been showing a surplus for about a decade, a substantial surplus, and they were intending to use that surplus, which was $2-3 billion a year. They were intending to use that surplus to upgrade the fleet of vehicles. The post office is not only the largest unionized employer in the United States, they're also the largest vehicle fleet owner. They may be being superseded now by UPS and Amazon, given all the the COVID stuff going on. But they in 2006 they were the largest single. They owned the single largest fleet of vehicles in the United States. And in the summer of 2006, the post office had this whole big dog and pony show in Washington, D.C., where they rolled out a fuel cell vehicle, the kind of vehicle that goes from door to door and delivers mail. Those little square boxy things.
Right.
It was powered by a hydrogen fuel cell, and then they had a 10-ton truck that was powered by electricity. And they said, we're going to be rolling these out all across the United States. The first demonstration was going to be the city of San Diego. They were going to do the whole city of San Diego, and then they were going to spread it all across the country. And they announced this. And within a month or three, or within a relatively short period of time, I don't know the exact period of time, but in a relatively short period of time, the Republicans had come up with legislation saying you have to set aside $5 billion a year for your retirees 75 years from now, your retirees who are not yet born. No other organization in the United States or in the world, to the best of my knowledge, has to do something like that. So, Janelle, you are spot on.
Thank you.
And,
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much
All
for the
right.
call. Good talking to you. Dan in Baldwin, Michigan. Hey, Dan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, greetings, Tom. Is there any chance that families that have lost loved ones could have a class action suit against a president for dereliction of duty?
It's a reasonable question. Typically, people in office are insulated. It's called sovereign immunity. They're insulated from being sued
while in office
because of their actions or their failure to act. And the idea is that you don't want people in government to constantly be making choices based on trying to mitigate or minimize the probability that they'd be sued. I do think, though, that Fox News is vulnerable to this kind of a lawsuit. In fact, one has already been filed against them. We reported on that a week and a half ago. And some of the Fox News personalities might be vulnerable, and some of the right-wing radio hosts might be vulnerable to these kind of lawsuits, although I'm not a big fan of suing people in the media, being one myself.
Oh, yeah, I got you. I got a comment also.
Sure, go for it, Dan.
Well, our president really loves the Constitution, and there's only one line in the whole thing that he actually read. Article 2, last paragraph, part of his oath. And will, to the best of my ability. Apparently, that's what the boy's doing. He doesn't have any ability. You know what I mean?
I think that's a good description. Yeah, to the best of my ability. That's a good one, Dan. I congratulate you. You caught a good one there. Thank you for the call.
All right, thank you, Tom.
Geez, Mike. Yeah, good talking to you, Dan.
Yep.
My computer screen just froze up. So, Dan, you're just going to have to hang up your own phone there. I can't do it for you. In fact, the whole system just kind of froze up. I don't know what the deal is here. Oh, well. Anyhow, so the question, how do we handle Donald Trump? I think, number one, it's going to have to be a blowout in November, which means make sure that everybody you know is registered to vote. And, let's get all this, and not just registered. If you or your friends or your neighbors or the people that you know on Facebook or whatever it may be, anybody you know, if they are registered to vote, make sure that they're also signed up for absentee ballots, which is what they're called in most states. Here in Oregon, they're called normal ballots. But make sure that you're going to get a ballot in the mail. So anyhow, my computer has unfrozen, so we will continue our conversation in just a few minutes. We're actually going to be talking to Dr. Bandy Lee, a psychiatrist with Yale University, who wrote the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. DangerousCase.org. Stick around. We'll be right back. It's going to be fascinating.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these three guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit, and rolling it out as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson. And the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at thomhartmann.com.
Thank you.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Alan J. Lichtman, and it's titled Repeal the Second Amendment, The Case for a Safer America. This is from the introduction, titled The Book That Must Be Written. On April 28, 1996, 28-year-old Martin Bryant stopped at an inn near his home of Newtown in Tasmania, Australia, and shot to death its 2 owners. He then drove to the former penal colony and tourist attraction of Port Arthur, where he lunched at a cafe. After eating, Bryant pulled from his sports bag a semi-automatic rifle with a 30-round magazine that he had legally purchased through a newspaper ad. With no provocation, he began firing at patrons in the cafe and its gift shop. Before the police stopped his shooting spree, Bryant had murdered 35 and wounded 18 others. His motive remains unknown. There were people everywhere, bodies, said witness Lynn Beavis. I thought at the time, being a nurse, I've seen dead people, I've seen blood, I've seen things like this, but what I saw in there, nobody but perhaps a soldier would know what that was like. The leadership of a shocked nation responded to the Port Arthur massacre, not with thoughts and prayers, but with decisive action. The country's conservative-led government rebuffed their gun lobby and its American ally, the NRA, to adopt comprehensive national gun controls. In a 2015 broadside labeled Australia, There Will Be Blood, the NRA charged that those regulations, which Australia significantly tightened as of 2002, have, quote, robbed Australians of their right to self-defense and empowered criminals. If the NRA was right, America, with its lax control over firearms for alleged self-defense, should be one of the world's safest countries, certainly far safer than Australia, where criminals presumably evade gun controls to prey on defenseless, law-abiding citizens. Yet in the latest reporting year, gun homicides claimed 14,542 American lives, compared to 27 in Australia. And all homicides took 19,510 American lives, compared to 222 in Australia. Since the NRA issued its warning, firearm homicides have declined in Australia, while soaring by 3,534 in the U.S. An American is now over 30 times more likely per capita than an Australian to be murdered by a gun, and 7 times more likely to be murdered by any means. If we had rates comparable today to Australia's, some 14,000 American lives would have been saved from firearm homicides in 2017 alone. By the gun lobby's twisted logic, Japan, which has one of the world's strictest gun control laws, should be drenched in innocent blood. Yet out of a population of 127 million, shooters in Japan murdered only 3 persons and injured only 5 in firearm assaults throughout 2017. Australia and Japan are not outliers. As compared to residents of our closest peer democracies in the G7 group of nations plus Australia, an American in 2017 was over 20 times more likely to die from a gun homicide. The gun lobby would have you forget that gun deaths are not limited to murders. In 2017, 23,854 Americans died from gun suicides, 64% more than were killed in firearm homicides. As compared to the peer nations, the 2017 per capita rate of firearm suicides in the United States was 7 times higher, while the rate of suicides by other means was 40% lower. These other democracies all have strict firearm regulations. None has a constitutional right to keep or bear arms, a distinction the United States shares worldwide only with Guatemala, whose gun murder rate is the 3rd highest of some 195 nations worldwide. Why has America lagged behind the democratic world in protecting its citizens from needless death and injury? The culprit is not spending by the NRA on campaigns and lobbying, which other pressure groups exceeded. The real problem is that which gun control advocates fear to name, the Second Amendment. Led by the NRA, the gun lobby exploits a historically defective, perverse reinvention of this amendment to inspire their grassroots supporters, sell guns, and provide constitutional cover for their opposition to making us safer by regulating firearms. The competing movement for gun control has floundered in response to the gun lobby's triumphant marketing of the Second Amendment. Gun control advocates have righteous zeal and noble motives, but lack a winning strategy. Instead of forthrightly refuting the lobby's bogus claims, the gun control movement has instead fallen into the trap of lamely insisting, we support the Second Amendment, but we also support responsible gun control. With such a self-defeating strategy, the movement can never win. It plays on the gun lobby's home turf and fails to rally the American majority that favors stricter firearms regulations. It provokes only scorn from a gun lobby that dismisses yes but assurances as rank hypocrisy, and it ignores the clear history and the true meaning of the Second Amendment itself. The movement for gun control must strike hard with a new strategy. Repeal of the Second Amendment is not only right, but realistic. It would break open the political logjam and open a path for the comprehensive national gun control and safety measures that have eluded the American people for so long. None of these measures would confiscate firearms or stop Americans from using guns for hunting, sport shooting, antique collecting, or legitimate self-defense. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These form the Second Amendment. The book Repeal the Second Amendment by Alan J. Lichtman.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And if I sound a little muffled, I was wearing my social distancing face mask here that Sean's friend made for Louise and I. Really cool. Anyhow, on the line with us is Dr. Bandy Lee, assistant clinical professor of medicine at the Yale School of Medicine, a forensic psychiatrist with the Yale University Medical School, co-founder of the World Mental Health Coalition, and editor of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. The website is dangerouscase.org, and you can tweet Dr. Lee at Bandy, B-A-N-D-Y-X, Lee1. Dr. Lee, welcome back. It's been a while since we've talked. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm wondering if you think that Donald Trump is going downhill or uphill. He seems to be in fine fettle these days, as the old saying goes.
Well, from my perspective, he is going nowhere but downhill, but depending on perspectives, it may be seen differently. So often we look at his apparent successes or his seemingly getting his own way and interpret that as a success, whereas for me it's a sign of pathology that will eventually be destructive to those around him as well as himself.
Well, and all of us are around him. It seems to me that we've got over 20,000 dead Americans as a result of his, forgive the phrase, but pissing away several months of time. And
exactly.
Now he's trying to blame this on the governors. It looks to me like he's just producing another reality show here.
Well, those are the real serious dangers of this, and this is why, just as experts were warning against a viral pandemic as we are seeing now, as mental health experts, we had been warning against this because the signs of his mental pathology were pointing to a disastrous situation like this. And what was unusual was that there was no great crisis during the 3.5 years that he was president. And during his last year, we have gotten one of the greatest crises that we could be facing. Of course, it could have been contained to something much smaller, as has happened every few years. But unfortunately, we have him as president, so it's been magnified to the maximum possible.
Crises provide politicians, even mediocre politicians, even incompetent politicians, it comes to mind, it provides them with a great opportunity. Rudy Giuliani, for example, over the objections of pretty much everybody, put his emergency for the city of New York, the Emergency Response Center, at the top of the World Trade Center a year after it had been bombed by the blind sheikh and had been targeted on numerous occasions. It was like the most stupid place in all of New York City to put your emergency response center. And yet he came out of that smelling like a rose. George W. Bush spent 9 months completely ignoring the warnings of Al Gore and Bill Clinton and his own people, Richard Clark running around with his hair on fire inside Bush's White House. And yet he got so popular from 9/11 that he got himself 2 wars, got himself reelected. And Dick Cheney took his Halliburton stock, his company, from being on the verge of bankruptcy because of his acquisition of Dresser Industries in '98. To becoming, very, very rich. I mean, a multi-millionaire as a result of that. So do you think that if Trump can pull this off, if he can not even necessarily get reelected, but if he can just divert our attention enough from his failures that he can make this thing happen? And how does that tie into his sociopathy or his psychology? It seems to me that he's been running this grift his whole entire life, that, ADHD or whatever you want to call it, that his short attention span in school was probably earning him punishments from dad and mom and teachers, and which is why they had to dump him into a military school. And thus he discovered that if he just lied constantly, then he got away with things. After all, he was white, he was rich. What do you think?
Yes, all of those things played a role in his being able to get away with this. But of course, sociopathic individuals, as you say, are all around us all the time. They consist of anywhere between 1 and upper levels of 5% of the population. And so I have specialized in treating them, and therefore I have been exposed to many of them. But usually society contains them. What is unusual in this situation is that society was also impaired to a level that instead of being repelled by pathology, they felt attracted to it, or at least his followers were attracted enough, and the rest of us were powerless enough that this has gone on. And I'm glad you also mentioned Giuliani and Bush, because that was really the era when I saw deep-seated problems beginning to surface. Of course, the origin of those problems go back further. But it is, in many ways, very parallel. And, in fact, when it was revealed that Donald Trump had missed the coronavirus warnings and the seriousness of it, I immediately thought back to George W. Bush and the fact that people were also not able to see through the lies that were being told and the deceptions that were being made during the time of George W. Bush, or even Rudy Giuliani, who just grabbed a situation that was already improving on its own and then claimed all credit for improving New York City and so on. But we are now seeing it at a level that's multifold worse. And rather than the population recognizing this and being in outrage about it, what we see is that the population is acquiescing even further. And so the more abuse they receive, in other words, it is really abuse, both physical and survival related and psychological. So the more the population is abused, the more it's accepting abuse and admiring the abuser and idealizing him and following along. And that is a very worrisome sign.
Dr. Lee, we're going to hit a hard break here in a minute, in literally 1 minute. But George W. Bush, at least, and I believe this is a characteristic of high-functioning sociopaths, was able to behave as if he had empathy and as if he cared and as if he understood what was really going on, and probably actually even did understand what was really going on. Donald Trump seems not to be able to even pretend to have empathy. Is that a function of a low IQ, or is that a function of just severe damage, severe sociopathy? How come he can't pull it off? Ted Bundy could fake being a nice guy. Why can't Trump?
Well, he's finding less of a need to. He can do it when his survival absolutely depends on it. But he's finding that he can get away with quite a lot without being accused. Just as he said during the campaign, he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot, and people will still approve of him.
Yeah, and he did say that. And I think, we've got over 20,000 dead Americans now. He's shot more than one of us. Dr. Bandy Lee, the author of the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. DangerousCase.org is the website. You can tweet Dr. Lee at BandyXLee1. Dr. Lee, thanks so much for dropping by.
Thank you for having me.
Thom Hartmann Program.
My pleasure. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. It's 15 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, live from Shelter in Place in Oregon. And welcome back. Hey, Tim in Aloha, Oregon. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I've got the most significant number that the latest number I read in the newspaper. They're talking about how much the average person makes, and it goes through professional athletes and entertainers, and the number is $87.5 million. Do you know what that corresponds with, Tom?
No, I don't.
That's what Rush Limbaugh made last year.
$87 million bucks?
$87.5 million. That's what Rush Limbaugh made last year. You see what I mean? You guys are soliciting funds to actually tell people the truth and inform people about what's going on in the world, and that guy made $87.5 million for being a homophobic, racist, misogynistic lunatic. So where do you go from there?
It's also because he's on 400 or 500 radio stations, and they're the biggest radio stations in the country.
But who's listening to him? You see what I mean? Somebody has to be listening to him because it's all about demographics and market share. You see what I mean? And that's what happens, And now they're starting the whole thing with this latest thing about this woman who says Biden molested her in 1993. I call it the Monica Lewinsky syndrome. What we're going to see is more of his relationship with Obama and Clinton and the Benghazi. That's all going to start coming to the fore pretty soon,
Sure. The question is, will it stick? I'm skeptical that it'll stick, Tim.
Well, you always hopefully you can look to the bright side, but I don't know. With as much as corruption there was to put that guy into office, 60 million people still voted for him. You know what I mean? That's the scary part. All right.
Yeah, it is, and it truly is. Thank you very much for the call. Good talking with you. Tim, thank you. Michael in Darien, Illinois. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Yes, first-time caller. And
thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, just fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about voting, and I was wondering why they can't have voting on a Saturday or a weekend versus having to vote on a Tuesday. I mean, I think
because
number
the
of people
Constitution specifies the Constitution specifies the first Tuesday of November, and it did so because that was the period. They didn't want to do it the weekend because that was when people went to services. Saturday for Jews, Sunday for Christians. And they didn't want to do it midweek because that was when the market was held, and so it ended up with Tuesday. There were actually a couple of pieces to the logic chain that I'm forgetting because it's been 30 years since I read this stuff. But there was actually a reason why they chose that particular date, and it had to do with America being an agricultural country and small farmers and all that kind of stuff. That no longer applies, but it would take a constitutional amendment to get it out of the Constitution. The way that states have gotten around it is by having early voting, where people can vote on the weekend before or the 2 weekends before or in the days before. But you're not going to get that out of the Constitution without a lot of trouble.
I see. I thought that might have been a simpler solution to get more people to vote.
Well, the simple solution is it says the election will be held on this date, which means that that's the date when you actually count the votes. But you could have people vote for an entire month if preceding that if you wanted, just as long as you don't count the votes until that first Tuesday of November. Or second Tuesday in November, whatever it is. I think it's the first Tuesday in November. States are getting around it, and vote by mail certainly does that. I mean, we get our ballots almost a month in advance here in Oregon, in Portland. So, Michael, thanks. It was a great question. Great question. We'll be right back. It's 19 minutes past the hour. Coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a special video up over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program, and it's about how a letter that the IRS sent out to 3.9 million Americans saved 700 lives. And you're like, wait a minute, the IRS saved 700 lives? How did that happen? Well, it had to do with Obamacare, and it's a fascinating story. And it turns out that this analysis of this IRS mailing was actually the first time that the federal government has done a study that actually proved that people having access to health care produces fewer deaths. For every 1,648 people who got the letter, there was one fewer premature death. I'll explain the whole thing in the video. It's as I said, it's available over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and it is really worth checking out. And it's a great ad, essentially, for our national health care system. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just wanted to recap some of the other stuff that's in the news today. We've been kind of going through it the first half hour of every hour throughout the day as we just touch on these things. One of the big points that I want to make, and I think it's probably worthy of an extended rant all by itself, but it's really an important point. And this goes to Donald Trump's tweet this morning about how he's Captain Bligh on the HMS Bounty. And, he's a British officer who's going to torture his sailors. And implying a threat to let people die in blue states. I mean, this is not funny. This is deadly serious stuff. Somebody's grandma is dying as we speak. People are dying at the rate of 1 every 40 seconds in the United States from this disease that Donald Trump let loose on our country, or allowed to go loose in our country. Every 40 seconds, somebody dies. 25 people have died since this hour began, on average. And Donald Trump is threatening to weaponize that. But here's the thing. He's doing it to seize control of the news cycle. This is how he got himself elected in 2016. This is how he got all the big loans from the banks back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. This is how he built his real estate empire to the extent that it is. I mean, he's massively in debt. He probably has more debt than he has assets. He's probably technically bankrupt right now. He desperately wants his hotels and his golf courses to open back up again because they were a revenue source for him. He can't visit a golf course and force the Secret Service to pay thousands of dollars a night for hotel rooms and rental of his golf carts if the courses aren't open. He's freaking out about this. And I don't know why the news media doesn't point out that Donald Trump has his own personal interest in reopening the country. And that's the only thing that ever motivates him. But the point that I wanted to make is it's all a show. He's doing a show on us. Now, the news media is loving it, just like CBS did before the election. Remember Les Moonves, the president of CBS, on that investor call said, you know, Donald Trump is terrible for the country. Now, this is before the election. Donald Trump is terrible for the country, but he sure is making money for CBS. Keep it up, Donald. Keep it up. Remember that? And now he's saying, I have total authority. Again, I think that this is just, I mean, he just knows that bombast sells. Back years ago, he was asked what his favorite book was. This was before he was running for president. And he said it was a book by P.T. Barnum. And I actually bought the book and read it. And it was a nice little kind of Dale Carnegie, Norman Vincent Peale. It was a precursor to those books. This was in the 1890s. Carnegie and Peale were in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And, it was a self-help book. But P.T. Barnum famously said, I don't care what they say about me as long as they spell my name right. And that has been Donald Trump's number one strategy since he was in his 20s. Be outrageous, get attacked, get criticized. He's having an affair on his wife, with his girlfriend right out in public. His wife busts it. He gets busted for it. He cops to it. He has his girlfriend come out and say, oh, he's best sex ever. That was the headline in the New York Post. We're talking about back in the 80s. And then that woman becomes his second wife, and then he has an affair on her. And then he picks up his third wife, going back to his original thing of, let's get somebody from a third world country here as a wife. And it was all about, arm candy. It was all about how it plays in the media. This guy has been running a reality show since the 70s. And his only goal is to make sure every day that we're talking about him. And now it may be backfiring on him. Peter Ricketts is the Republican governor of Nebraska. And he has refused to do a shelter-in-place order because Donald Trump has not signaled that it's time. In fact, if anything, the opposite is the case. Trump is saying, maybe in 2 weeks, on May 1st, we can just go back to normal. Well, the people of Nebraska are starting to get seriously upset about this. There is a city in Hall County, Nebraska called Grand Island, where there has just been an explosion of COVID-19 cases. And there have been 4 deaths. Now, this isn't, just melting down yet, but they've got 3 nursing homes in this town, and all 3 of them have people testing positive for the coronavirus. And the mayor of this town is begging the governor to do a shelter in place, because even if he shuts down his own town, if the governor doesn't do the whole thing, it's going to be a disaster, because people are moving, in and out of his town and his county and stuff like that. So Nebraskans are starting to get seriously upset with Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Lindsey Graham went on Fox and Friends this morning to say we need to cut, those unemployment benefits with the extra $600 a week. We need to cut that by $7 an hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Hey, South Carolinians, Lindsey Graham thinks that if you're on unemployment, you're making too much money. He wants to cut your benefits.
Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I've grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise. But every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with the low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others. These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the Plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini.
Coming up on this week's Science Revolution is Zach Corrigan with Food and Water Watch. Could another zoonotic pandemic be coming? Thomas Lindsay with the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights is here on the rights of nature and how they may have kept Pennsylvania from industry harm. And Friends of the Earth, Lucas Ross is dropping by on the big oil bailout and how fracking could be next. Plus, Arthur West with the Washington League for Increased Transparency and Ethics is suing Fox So-Called News for endangering Americans by calling the coronavirus a hoax. Can he win? The Science Revolution is available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Mark in Sauk City, Wisconsin. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hey, I'd like the press to start reporting, for the individual states what Trump has taken away from that individual states. That being somebody who's currently immune compromised due to my chemotherapy, that I'd just like to make sure that the nursing professionals that are taking care of me and everybody else are actually properly equipped. That scares me that Trump is stealing from everybody just to enrich himself.
Right.
And it's pretty disgusting. And for one of your previous callers said, "Look on the bright side of life." I couldn't help but thinking of Monty Python's tune, "Look on the bright side of life." And I mean, people need to go out there and look at that because it perfectly fits the situation we're in right now. Because we're chewing on life's gristle right now, and that we need to actually try to look on the bright side of life. Like I did this morning when I found out Jill Krofsky actually won the Supreme Court seat last night. That because I went to bed not knowing and woke up to that. So that's something good.
A little bit of good news.
We need a little bit of good news, and there's some other Trump, I guess, endorsements or Republican endorsements that didn't win last night. So, I mean, there's, hopefully that blue wave is coming, and hopefully it's going to turn into a tsunami and just wash Republicans away for the time being. That
I suspect that there's a lot of wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth in Republican circles following the results in Wisconsin. I think that they figured that they really were going to pull this thing off and get the right winger on the Supreme Court and all those things. And now they're seeing that the depths of Democratic rage and the intensity of basically the shock and horror right across the board that Americans are experiencing and feeling. Watching this man on television every day strut and preen and posture and bloviate. I'm waiting for politicians to start to peel away from him. Again, Lindsey Graham, for example, saying people in South Carolina are getting too much on unemployment. I don't think South Carolina's had their primary yet. I think it's in May or June. And my thoughts, I was saying this last year that toward the end of the year, that after the Republican primaries were over, and people like Lindsey Graham no longer had to worry about some Tea Party or some teabagger coming on after them, that maybe they would start peeling away from Trump. Now I'm beginning to doubt it because of how strongly Fox News has bonded themselves to Trump. They view themselves now in competition with One America News that has out-Trumped even Fox News. And the whole right-wing media thing is getting very, very bizarre. Mark, I wish you the very best. Stay safe, my friend, and thanks for the call. Rich, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Well, I remember watching the Ed Shields show, God rest his soul. He showed that the Constitution says the government will have a post office, and I think it was in the Fourth Amendment. He actually showed the Constitution.
And Article 1, Section 8, but it authorizes Congress. It authorizes Congress to appropriate money to create a post office and to pay for what are referred to in Article 1, Section 8 as postal roads. And but it doesn't say that Congress shall. It says Congress may.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought that's what it meant. I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, it's all good, Richard, and it's very unfortunate that it doesn't say Congress shall, because I don't think the founders ever imagined the day would come when an idiot king, wannabe king, would be running the United States and would be planning to blow up the post office. It's just mind-boggling. Thanks for the call, Tamara in Pacifica, California. Hey, Tamara, what's up? Or is it Tamara?
Hey, Tom. Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Good. What's up?
Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm going to put you on hold, Tamara, and let Joyce work that out. Apparently, you're having a problem hearing us. Jessica in Riverside, Tamara is on line 6, Joyce. Jessica in Riverside, Illinois. Hey, Jessica, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. This is in response to the caller who asked if people could sue the administration and Trump. The president ordered all those Americans back from Europe at the same time. And where we're from in Chicago, there was a mob scene at O'Hare, a line that was insane, people wall to wall. And my husband and I were watching that on the news, and I told my husband, I said, they're all going to get coronavirus. And my husband said, oh, no, you're being so dramatic, and none of that will happen. Well, here's the thing that happened. One of his friends he knows from school was in that line with her husband. And turns out 2 weeks later, they both have coronavirus. And turns out her husband died of coronavirus. And she is fighting for her life. But the thing is, the idiot is killing off his wealthy voters, too. Those were the people with lots of money that came back from Europe. And he didn't seem to... They didn't care. If it was me personally, I would never have walked into a line like that. I would have hid behind cargo outside. We have to protect ourselves. We have to deal with this. Yeah. And I watched your show yesterday, and I loved it. You have the exact same opinions of me. We just have to protect ourselves. He doesn't care who he kills off.
Yeah, no, in fact, I think he's delighting in it. I think this is a man, as a child, there's this famous story about George W. Bush. When he was a kid, after his sister died, he started killing little animals. That's what serial killers do. And pull the wings off flies when they're even younger than that. And I just see, Donald Trump doing that too, or being like that. I think we have an actual psychopath in the White House, and it's just not my opinion. It's we've had several psychiatrists on this program, one just an hour ago, saying the exact same thing, or a half hour ago. Jessica, thank you. That's a horrific story about your husband's friends, and yeah, it would be interesting to look at Chicago trends. Of course, a lot of those people didn't stay in Chicago. That was the customs line. They went through customs, and then they got on, they got on a flight to their hometowns, and so that's got to be a big problem. Randy in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Randy, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I wasn't able to hear your interview with the psychiatrist, unfortunately, but I think Democrats have to take a page from Winston Churchill, because early in the war, well before Pearl Harbor, he established a small cadre of psychiatrists and gave them access to all the information they had so they could remotely psychoanalyze Hitler. And when you hear that, you realize, I don't know how well that turned out, but it's a great idea. And I think Democrats have to do the same thing with Trump. Churchill understood that Hitler was a sick puppy, and we all know that Trump is in the forces of a lot of demons he cannot control. At least if we do something like that, we can predict things. And we won't be so shocked by everything he does.
Yeah, it's been 35 years since I lived in Germany and was doing a deep dive into William Scherer and other books on the history of World War II. But my recollection, and let me qualify this heavily because I may be wrong. I'm trying to do something with a 30-year-old memory here. But my recollection is that one of the things that I know that Churchill did assemble psychologists to psychoanalyze Hitler and come up with a strategy to hurt Hitler psychologically. And I believe that what they came up with, one of the things that they came up with, was to widely publicize the story, whether it was true or not. I don't honestly know or recall that Hitler only had one testicle and was impotent. And, that was widely distributed. That information was widely distributed across Germany via the British equivalent of Radio Free Europe. And, to humiliate and enrage Hitler, to cause him to behave in intemperate fashion. And I don't know if what's her name, Stormy Daniels, talking about mushrooms has done it to Trump, but good point, Randy, good point. The Democrats should get a shrink to work on Trump. John in Florida. Hey, John, what's up? Got a minute to the break, John, by the way. No, John. Okay. Bill in Clifton, New Jersey. Hey, Bill, you're on the air. What's up?
Yeah, hey, Tom. I remembered the iron lung, and I looked it up, which does the same thing as a respirator, except it worked using negative pressure from the outside rather than positive pressure being forced through the lungs. And
right. I remember those back in the 50s and 60s.
Well, as of 2017, in this article I read, there were still 6 Americans still on iron lungs from the 1950s. And It's a great idea. They actually, you can find these cute images of the portable ones they made in the 50s, but it can be made, and they're working on it to go around the chest, and it works to inflate the lungs from the outside and make it easier to breathe if you're conscious, so they don't have to shove a tube down your
right. It's a non-invasive, but they're giant, heavy pieces of equipment. But that's fascinating, Bill. Bill, thanks for sharing that with us. We'll be back. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. We'll be right back. And welcome back. John in Florida. Hey, John, what's up?
Hey, thanks for getting me back on the line. I was trying to find the reference that I saw earlier in Facebook about a governor declaring a holiday for election. I don't know if I read it correctly. Have you heard anything about that for the November election?
I have not. Generally governors are. Point. Okay.
As far as governors and states' rights over the national election, is it possible that the governors, and I know that there's a certain amount of West Coast governors that are trying to create a certain nation-state kind of feel, but is there a chance that a consortium of governors and state governors can kind of ensure that we have a November election, or is that completely out of their domain? They have no way of actually preventing some sort of state of national emergency, fake or otherwise, to stop us from having elections in November?
Good question, John. I don't know the answer to it. What I do know is that the federal government basically oversees the Electoral College, but it doesn't oversee the actual elections. It administers the Electoral College, but individual states choose who the electors will be. Individual states run their own election systems. They decide. The one thing that is mandated is the date of the elections. That's in the Constitution, the first Tuesday in November. But beyond that, individual states decide whether you have to register to vote. For example, in North Dakota, you don't even have to register to vote. You just show up and vote. In every other state, you got to register. Registration for voting is a leftover from the Jim Crow era. In some states, you can vote for.
Could we have a mass of governors declare all of what you call in Oregon just a regular ballot, but an absentee ballot in other states to be legal?
Vote by mail. Yeah. It would depend on the constitutions of the state. I'm guessing very few of the states actually deal with voting stuff through their constitutions, but there may be some. And then lacking that, it would depend on the laws of the states. The legislatures define these things. The legislature decides whether you need a doctor's slip to get to be able to vote absentee ballot. That's the case in many states. The legislature decides whether you have vote by mail. It was passed. I remember when it was passed here in Oregon. It was passed by the state legislature, and there might have been a citizens' referendum. It might be possible. With a referendum, you can actually amend constitutions in many states, about half of our states, and you can make laws. So these things could be done by referendum, too, in some states. But, this is the reason why governors, I think up to this point, no governor has declared Election Day as a holiday, is because it would be a big hit to state revenues. They would have to give all the state workers the day off. There would be less economic activity. They don't want to, cycle down their economies. But this November, it may well be that, large chunks of the country are still sheltering in place. So, the rules may be very, very different, John. We're just going to have to wait and see. I think we're going to have a sense of this by probably the end of the summer, but, by August. Thank you. But, that's everything I know about that. John, thanks for the call. Good question. It's 10 minutes before the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option. Stick around. We'll be right back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And by the way, we had a caller a few minutes ago who said, was there a governor who declared the election day to be a state holiday? And turns out I didn't remember at the time, but Sean just reminded me it was Ralph Northam, who is the governor of Virginia. So that state has now turned election day into a state holiday. John in Los Angeles. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? I appreciate your work and everything, but I kind of had a hard time getting through when you asked the question about the Republican Party, about how their plan is getting to fall apart. And I heard when you said you kind of think this is it, that this is peak, and I got to disagree with you. I got to disagree with you because, one, from what I'm seeing and looking at, and how, like, for instance, this so-called Emergency CARES Act, we're not dealing with just Republicans. Their plan has actually worked. In fact, it worked so well that they have invaded into the Democratic Party. We got a one-party state now. I mean, and the evidence is, look who gets served first and look who gets served the loudest. To these who do the least of these. Well, they don't do to the least. They're trying to get rid of the least. They already won.
I will give you that Bill Clinton said we're going to end welfare as we know it, and the era of big government is over. And, Obama was willing to cut Social Security, et cetera, that there were a lot of, shall we say, neoliberal mistakes made by our last two Democratic presidents. But that said, the Democratic Party is nothing like the Republican Party. You got Lindsey Graham out there saying that the unemployment benefits are too generous. You will not hear any Democrat say that.
You won't hear it, but
for example,
look, they got a public view of where they say what they say that, but privately, nah. As I've looked at the way they've voted for the past 40 years, these Democrats.
And that's the point, John. On some of these individual issues, you've got a bunch of Democrats who went along with the bankruptcy bill in 2005 that said that students can't discharge student loans through bankruptcy any longer. It was a vicious piece of legislation that was being sponsored by the Republican Party, the banks and their lobbyists, and George W. Bush. But yeah, there were some Democratic senators. Joe Biden was among them, tragically. But most of them were from the Northeast. They were from the states where the banks really held a lot of power, who said, okay, we're going to go along with this because that's how politics was played. I think that respectfully, John, I really think that we're seeing a change in our political systems. And I think you're going to see a big change a year from now. And I hope we can have this conversation again in 10, 12 months. John, I'm not subscribing to your theory here. Tamara in Pacifica, California. Hey, Tamara, what's up?
Hey, good afternoon. Good morning.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Anytime somebody says, can you hear me, I need to put them on hold so that we can make sure that everything's fine. Jim in Valley Center, California. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
The lady a couple calls ago that talked about the Chicago airport and the vast amount of people coming back from Europe hit what I think was a home run that we should be on top of. Remember when they shut down the travel to Europe and all those people came back? They came to the airports and they were not tested. They weren't quarantined. They just were allowed to go back. Is there any reason why that may not be the major reason why New York and Chicago are two of the hot spots in the world?
Oh, I think it's a huge reason why. And you had those huge lines of people. We had a caller a little earlier who was saying that, out of the Chicago area, who was saying that a friend of her husband's, a couple, were in those lines coming back from Europe, and they both got coronavirus as a consequence of it. They became symptomatic exactly 2 weeks after being stuck in that Chicago airport for 5 hours in the customs line with 1,000 people. And I'm sure that the coronavirus has ripped through that. But, not all those people stayed in Chicago and New York. They went through those airports, to clear customs, and then they got on planes to Sioux Falls and Grand Forks and pick your town, right? And, Lansing, Michigan, all over the country. And so, yeah, Trump screwed up again. I mean, he just screwed up again. I don't know any other way to say it. Jim, thank you for the call. Tracy in Orlando, Florida. Hey, Tracy, what's up? We got a minute to the break. Tracy.
Tracy, thank you, Tom. I had a quick question about the doctor you just had on. I'm asking your opinion. She mentioned that there was something going on, just generally speaking, that made folks follow somebody that just wasn't in their interest, and it seemed as though they are doing it more. And would you think that is really a byproduct or a driver of white supremacy, people feeling more anxious that they're losing power, so they follow a person blindly?
Absolutely. And if you read John Dean's book, Conservatives Without Conscience, he talks about the authoritarian personality disorder, the authoritarian personality. It's about 20% of our population. The vast majority, 90+% of authoritarians are actually authoritarian followers. And these are the people who show up at MAGA rallies. And then you've got your small percentage of authoritarian leaders, and that's Donald Trump. And they know each other, right? They look into each other's souls and they go, oh, you're just like me. And that's what it's all about. And so start looking for authoritarian personality and associating that word with Donald Trump. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Tracy, thank you for the call. Great question. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. I believe Congressman Pocan is going to be with us in the first hour, taking your calls. And the second hour he'll be with us. Thank you, Sean. And in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. You've got to participate. Tag you're it. Tell your friends how to find Progressive Media.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism. This is from the introduction. Socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Socialist yearnings are as old as capitalism itself because they are its products. Where and when capitalism's problems and failings have accumulated criticism and critics, socialist voices have arisen.